company this Ramadan.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this week's edition of Bookbytes on the Ramadan show. I have a special pleasure of speaking about a very prominent individual in our Islamic communities, in our Muslim communities in South Africa, and a story that hasn't been documented before. And I think this is the significance of writing our stories, writing the stories of our ulama and writing the story of Islam in South Africa. And so today we'll be talking about the life and times of Imam Essa al Seppe, written by none other than Professor Suleman Dangor. Professor Dangor is emeritus professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, and he's written extensively, from his perspective in various aspects, given the platform in the academy. Professor Dangor, welcome to the show. Alhamdulillah for having you, and congratulations on yet another publication of a very significant figure documenting, a very, very special story. Welcome to Bookbytes.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me on your program. I think it's an honor to be on the program. And I don't think I am as prominent as you are making it out to be.
That humility is the leadership that we have. Shukran for that. It says so. I mean, the significance of the story, and it impressed upon me while I was reading it over the past few days that these stories that there's so many of these stories that get sort of brushed aside precisely because those who are making history and leading as you are, and in the case of Imam al Seppe, are not so worried about anyone knowing what they're really doing. And here it is, this fascinating story that the youth needs to read about. I'm going to read quickly from the back of the book. It says, Imam al Seppe is an unsung hero whose life story has remained untold since his death in 2002. This book captures the Imam's fascinating journey as an orator, critic, writer, organizational planner, and da'i. His thirst for knowledge is manifested in his many qualifications and awards by a number of NGOs by which he was employed. While he is popularly known as da'i, he was involved in multifaceted activities throughout his life. He was a severe critic of the government's apartheid policies, racism, and the Western media, though he was often interviewed by local media about diverse issues relating to Muslims in South Africa. And it goes on. This is commentary by Sheikh Zaid Tulani Langa, chairman of the SA Black Muslim Conference and president of the Muhammad V Foundation for African Ulama, the South African branch. Another prominent figure, of course. Tell me about the impetus, obviously, because I've touched on it, for writing the story of Imam Essa. Why it took two decades to get there, and obviously speak to us about your journey of putting the research together.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Imam Essa and I became friends in the 1990s. I can't quite recall how we met, but when we did meet, we started speaking about various issues relating to the Muslim community in South Africa. And at that time, I was a presenter on Radio Al Ansar. So I took Imam Essa with me, I think, on 3 different occasions for an interview on Radio Al Ansar. And so through those interviews, I got to know about his thinking. And one issue which troubled him very much was the relationship between the Indian and African or Black Muslims. And the reason for that is because his wife is of Indian origin, Fazila, and of course the children are of mixed origin. So when they started going to school, they bore the brunt of mocking and ridicule and all kinds of things. This, of course, was very painful to the children, and they came home to, told the parents what was going on in school. Obviously, parents were very upset about it. Imam Essa, in particular, was very sensitive about this particular issue. So the issue of racism is very prominent in his thoughts and in his writings. And you see there's a chapter on the relationship between African Indian Muslims, although it's not bitter because his wife is, of course, Indian, and the organization, the NGOs that he worked for apart from SENCO, the rest were Muslim organizations which are headed by Indian Muslims. But so he was not bitter. He was trying to, and in fact, he wrote one article to talk about how we can reconcile between the two communities. And so I included this particular chapter, the relationship between the two. And he actually wrote an article about how the two can, meet and how they can uh, patch the differences and so on. So because he say we are one ummah in this country, there's no reason why we should be divided on racial or ethnic lines. Now, the reason why it took so long, I'm not sure, because Imam Essa was very, very meticulous in keeping records. So he had, he's written a number of articles which have never been published, and I included just three of them in the book. But he also delivered khutbahs in various masajid in South Africa as well as in Namibia. He kept a record of those khutbahs. He had a number of interviews by various newspapers. He kept the clippings there, and so a number of and of course lots of photographs that were taken, and those are also kept very carefully. And also there was a little autobiography, which is very important because you could get information about his own family, his early education, and so on. Now, all this was kept in two boxes actually by Fazila. So we need to really, uh, our gratitude really goes to Fazila. She did not throw away after 20 years. She kept them, out of her respect and love for her husband. She kept these. And for a long time, I've been talking to her about the possibility of recording his life. And then in between, I mean, I got involved in other projects, so a range of them. And then a few years ago, I suddenly decided, I need to get down to this. It was the same with the MSA. I also was, talking about a long time about writing a book on MSA. Eventually, I've gone down to it as well. So these were two of the, you might say, pet projects, which alhamdulillah I managed to accomplish in the last 5 years. So then I went to visit Swazila and I said to her, initially I thought maybe I'll get 40 or 50 pages. And then she said, you know what, there are two boxes full of documents. I said, okay, give it to me, I'll go through them. And I just started going through documents. I was quite fascinated what I found there. I mean, I knew maybe 10% of Imam Isa's life. The 90% were actually in the boxes. And I began to read his articles. I looked at his newspaper clippings. I looked at his autobiography. And of course, correspondence. He had, correspondence with people all over the world, and he kept those letters as well. And those are very important because you know who he contacted, and the contents of the letters. What they were discussing and so on. I think those are very, very important. So all these documents, I looked at them, and then I started, okay, let me start writing them. And alhamdulillah, we managed to get up to over 120 pages. Of course, also in between, I interviewed a few individuals who knew him pretty well. So I think that's the way we got it all together, alhamdulillah, and the book has been published.
Now, I'm always excited and fascinated to hear about the process of bringing these biographies and these documents together. And it is indeed very special that Imam Al Seppe's wife had kept all these documents, because I see in the appendix as well, you've got like the handwritten notes that he'd made. Some of the essays that he wrote is in handwritten format, both in Arabic and in English. So I thought that was incredibly valuable to add to the document as well. But his experience is also vast in that, I mean, okay, so you spoke a little bit about and a very important topic that remains problematic is that the issue of racism within the Muslim community, and this idea that as Muslims of Indian origin, do we still hold on to this idea that Islam is the domain of Muslims of Indian origin? It's a problematic stance, and it still needs work and weeding out. Precisely because it's against the tenets of what we believe as Muslims. And so those elements definitely need to be weeded out, and it's still problematic 2 decades or more later. And then this concept of looking at, Imam taking from the personal to the political and vice versa, because he was politically active as well. Let's talk about his politics of the time, the beginnings, and his role in the anti-apartheid struggle as well.
Yeah, I think we can start with his time at Assalam. He went there as a student. He also worked there for a short while. But as a student, he came across works by what you call Islamic movement. And Islamic movement in the past was Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun of Egypt, Jamaat Islami of Pakistan, and of course later on it was the Iranian Revolution. But at the time he was there, it was mainly Ikhwan, maybe Maudud in literature, and that broadened his vision because, as you know, he was not a Muslim. He accepted Islam, and initially, as we know, we always focus on Aqidah, basic teachings, and rituals, and so on. But now, when he got to Assalam, he came across this what we call Islamic movement literature. So primarily, writings by Hassan al-Banna and so on. And then he, of course, realized that Islam is very comprehensive, covers every facet of life and so on, including politics, education, uh, economics, and so on. So I think that's where his political consciousness started. And he said, "Look, as a Muslim, I cannot divorce myself from politics. I need to be, also involved in some way." Then, of course, when he was sent to Namibia, this was a time when it was Southwest Africa was gaining its independence, and there were lots of Muslims who were based there. They're part of the UN, and lots of exiles were returning now to Southwest Africa, and some of them had accepted Islam while they were in exile. So he met all this range of people, foreigners who were based there, part of the UN, and then of course Muslims who came back from exile, and then he established the Namibia Islamic movement. There was a center there in Windhoek, so he came into contact immediately, of course, obviously with SWAPO. And that's how he got involved in politics in SWAPO. Now, what happened is, if you look at, there's a chapter on Dawah. It's quite a fascinating chapter because while he was a Da'i, of course, he started Dawah. He worked for Islamic Dawah movement and also Wami later on. Um, and then, of course, he was actually sent as a Da'i by South African Islamic Youth Conference to Namibia. He was sent as a Da'i, but if you look at his uh, his concept of dawah, it's substantially different from what we understand as dawah. So he had a very broad vision of dawah, and one of the important things, of course, is that he could not divorce the dawah from politics. And it's not possible to separate the two. If you are a da'i, you need to understand the context in which you're operating. Obviously, it's a socio-political context, and that's what he found himself in. Because in South Africa, at that time, I don't think we were the youth movement was that much active at that particular time. But when he got to Namibia, of course we had Column Islam, Qibla, and so on. But when he went to Namibia, this thing was pretty hot at that time, the Swampo, and so he got involved. And so his dawah, of course, the people who sent him from South Africa were not too happy about it because they said we sent him to do dawah, and now he's spending his time in politics. So obviously, racism was very important for him because of his personal experience and so on. And when he got back, he also joined Sanko, right? And Sanko actually had sent him overseas for training. So he was able to understand the context in which he was operating. And then, of course, when he got back,
I'm not sure if we've lost Prof for a second there. We'll just wait for him to reconnect. But look, a significant discussion on about the life and times of Imam Essa al Seppe. And an interesting part of the discussion, obviously, is his discussion around Imam's personal politics and the politics of the time. We'll just wait for, I think Prof has to reconnect. We'll just wait for him to reconnect, inshallah. So what's interesting is, I'm looking again at the comments made by Sheikh Zaid Langa, and this reflects very well being in a modest home and brought up in a multi-faith and multiracial society in the former East Sudan. Imam Essa rose to become the leader of several organizations. His collection of documents, many of which have made it into this, includes correspondence with Muslims in leadership positions globally. The list of his unpublished works reveals the breadth of his knowledge of Islam. He was an eternal scholar, from what I've read. It's only through reading this seminal work on Imam Essa that one begins to appreciate the life of a man who lived to serve humanity despite his straitened circumstances. This book is a must-read for readers who are interested in the life experiences of unheralded personalities such as Imam Essa al Seppe. And what I find particularly interesting, and we'll wait for Prof to come back on so we can actually pick his brain on this, is Imam al Seppe was also, having gone to Namibia, they write and he speaks about his experiences there and the kind of racism of the time that embeds itself in this idea of an extremist ideology as Islam is seen to be by the apartheid state at the time. So I definitely want to hear more about that from Prof as soon as he's back online, inshallah. The other sort of perspective is that I don't think we can overlook how important it is to document these stories. I think that there's a wealth of social history in our communities that still needs to be written. To hear that this, took so many years to put together. I mean, 22 years now since Imam Essa al Seppe passed away, and I think that organizations like OCAF, for example, who is behind this project, and the work of Professor Dangor must be commended. I do know that the book is available online and through the OCAF network and at Hikmah, the Baitul Hikmah store in Durban and online. And I think that more of us need to be reading just to get a real understanding and appreciation of where we've come through, not just through the anti-apartheid struggle, but also as Muslims in South Africa, the groundwork that has been laid out and the struggle for that groundwork to have been laid out is very, very significant. So those are the kinds of things that really, really stand out. I'm looking at the foreword written by Brother Malik Arafat, another prominent character in our community. And he says, great leaders are best epitomized by their works rather than their words. The Imam was such a person. It's so amazing to hear and read from someone who was in touch with the Imam. He was far ahead of most of his Muslim peers, in particular the indigenous African Muslims. It is clear in this book how his approach to practicing Islam was clearly founded on self-realization and communal activism. He acknowledged his Korean Sun origins, confirmed his African roots, identified with the global African and Muslim struggle against colonialism, and interpreted Islam with the need to benefit society. It is very clear in this manuscript how the Imam's personal and communal life mirrored the everyday struggles of indigenous African Muslims at the height of apartheid South Africa and even in the post-apartheid era. He dealt with personal struggles to interpret the teachings of Islam by overcoming racism and marrying an Indian Muslim lady, albeit with the classist and xenophobic backlash from the Indian Muslim community. He was involved in the struggle against apartheid in both South Africa and Namibia. He worked very closely with Muslim and non-Muslim individuals and organizations in South Africa and abroad, even at the cost of his personal safety. Here is a man who lived his words. Imam Essa al Seppe will be remembered for his charisma, insightful intellect, courage, and selflessness. We are honored to have known and met him. He will always be our reference point. Hopefully, the new generation of indigenous African Muslims will adopt him as their hero. He represented them very well at a time when Islam was largely unknown in the townships. This book is a worthy read. May Allah forgive and bless us all one by one, without exception. Ameen Ya Rabbal Alameen. Brother Malik A.N. Arafat. I think that was a beautiful sort of tribute to start this collection, and it just speaks to the power of writing these stories and the necessity for our youth, for us to be able to engage this material, to have copies on our bookshelves. Professor Dangor, thanks. Welcome back online. I know we lost you there for a bit, and you were in the middle of your conversation. But let's get into. I just read, the forward to the book. Let's get into Imam's journey to Namibia and the racism he experienced there. But also, I spoke also about what I want to hear from you is what happened when there was this idea that he's coming with this sort of um, fundamentalist ideology that's going to rock the boat. The racism around seeing Islam as a subversive practice within Namibian society and also in the apartheid state.
Oh yes, in Namibia he had a problem because the I think the Dutch in Namibia, Germans, they were very concerned that here was a man who came to introduce Islam. Of course, these churches are or these Christians are very committed, and there were newspaper articles in which they really condemned him or bringing Islam into Namibia. They were very concerned about the spread of Islam and how it was going to affect Namibian society. So, but we see that there was a response to this, and those responses are also published in the paper. Yeah. So they were certainly concerned in Namibia, because Namibia, as you know, was largely Christian, and there were very few Muslims at the time. But alhamdulillah, through Imam Isa's work, people began to adopt Islam, and he was able to attract people to his center. And if we look at the photograph of his center, it's a very basic structure. And his home, really, it's like one of these homes you'll find in our informal settlements. That was the type of home he lived in. And yet, people from South Africa, when they welcomed them to his home, some of them stayed there actually. And he was always, he and his wife always welcomed South Africans. But apart from South Africans, there were many people who he popped in at his place on the way. Um, and along the mosque, of course, were political activists. So he used to host them, and they stay a few days and then move on. So he was involved with activists in Namibia, and of course, when it came to South Africa, in Cape Town, it was the Muslim youth movement primarily, which gave him an ear. And he was obviously very disappointed that the broader Muslim community did not actually, take heed, because he was talking about supporting the independence of Southwest Africa. And so his activism, but I think very importantly, I forgot about, there's a whole chapter on the Africa Muslim Party. And he actually, uh, he approached it from the angle of the marginalization of African Muslims. And here is what is basically saying that how could they establish a party without consulting the African people? Because primarily represents Indian Muslims and North African Muslims. And of course, you also say at the top at the time, it was started by Indian Muslims and leadership was Indian Muslim and so on. So Africans by and large were marginalized. And so now, if we look at it, he wrote quite a bit about Africa Muslim Party. I tried to put in as much as possible. But again, primary thing, the whole issue was about racism. I mean, how could they leave out such an important sector of the Muslim
Mm.
community? So where they have it with the AMP on the one hand, and of course his involvement in political activism, and of course also led to problems not only with the Christian church, but there were elements inside Namibia itself, the local Namibian Muslims who became, I think, quite envious of Imam Isa's popularity, and they also began to try and undermine him and his movement.
But you say over time in the book that he was able to bring people from different faiths together at his center. And so that reads, would you say that reads as a form of social cohesion? Was he able to convince people over time that this was, Islam was a form of social cohesion at the time when people needed leadership and they needed that bringing together?
Yeah, even here in South Africa, he was involved with the um, interfaith movement. And I was also involved with the same movement. I started before then, so I used to meet him in this movement, the World Conference on Religion and Peace, WCRP. So it was in Namibia because when he started getting involved in politics, obviously the people would belong to different faiths, so he couldn't separate them. Say, okay, I'm only going to meet Muslims. So he met mainly Christians apart from Muslims, and so that interaction with different faith communities was very important in Namibia as well.
I was particularly when I first picked up a copy, when you first gave me the copy, um, I knew that there would be depth, and I had not read of Imam Al Seppe before. And so I know that there's so many of us who are, missing out if we're not reading stories of this nature, documenting such seminal work throughout his lifetime. What is your hope for this particular volume that you've put together, and a message out there for especially for the youth reading?
Well, I think this relationship between African and Indian Muslim and Malay Muslims, because nowadays I prefer to use the word Asian to refer to both Indian and Malay Muslims. There's always been contestation about whether you can say African Muslims or Black Muslims, but I think increasingly they are beginning to use the black label themselves. You look at Buffalo's book; he's used the word Black Muslims more than 100 times, and then you have the South African Black Muslim Conference. So they no longer see this as racist. They see this as a matter of pride. So we look at Steve Biko, for instance. He said black is beautiful, and what he was basically telling black people, don't feel inferior. You don't have to feel inferior because you are black, and so you must take pride in your blackness. So I think that influence has also come through. If you look at Buffalo himself, he will say he was definitely influenced by black consciousness. So I think to that extent, black Muslims. That's why I also started using the word black Muslims, because they themselves are quite comfortable in using it. All right. So the issue is this relationship. It has not been, how should I say, a very smooth relationship. There are times when it has become quite rocky. There have been accusations of racism, very often true. Sometimes there were perceptions, and but especially now, it's very important for, say, the Asian Muslim community and the Black Muslim community to come together as one ummah, as one unity, because the problems that are facing us, they're not unique to any particular racial or ethnic group. It's collectively, of course, we're also looking at immigrant Muslims. They are from all over Africa, so many different countries, Sudan, Senegal, Malawi, Somalia, all over, Nigeria, apart from the Arab states in the north, like Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and so on. These people, I mean, there's so many, we're not sure about actual statistics, but a possibility is they actually outnumber South African Muslim by now. So we need to transcend our barriers. These are our barriers, Asian Muslim barrier versus Black Muslim, and then South African Muslim versus the foreign nationals. These barriers must be transcended, because when you look at the global picture, you can see this assault on Islam. It's global. It's all over in Europe, United States, India, Burma, all over. It's happening. China as well. So if we don't stand together as an ummah, they're going to pick us off one by one. So I think Imam Isa's contribution would be: listen, we need to be together. We should overcome our ethnic and racial and linguistic differences. So I think the youth need to understand this. We do not live in silos, and especially now at the end of apartheid, these boundaries have been broken, but we still, as Asian Muslim community, need to transcend the boundaries and begin to function as one united ummah. And I think that's a very important message that Imam Isa has brought in. Of course, we also know that he was very critical of the media, and today we are facing that particular problem. Islamophobia is a big challenge for Muslims throughout the world. Fortunately, in South Africa, alhamdulillah, at this point, we don't have that problem, but globally, Muslims are facing this. And already in the 90s, Imam Isa was talking about the bias of the Western media. And today, especially with this conflict in Gaza, we can see exactly how the Western media has been so biased against Muslims, against Arabs, and so on. But very interestingly, that I think over the last few weeks or months, we see a change in the way the Western media or media houses are beginning to portray what's happening in Gaza. Of course, it's not germane to what we are discussing, but basically, he has written, he has spoken about, he was invited actually by the Islamic Society of Harvard College to speak about the bias of the Western media, and he's written about it here as well. So again, the message is that our youth need to read, they need to educate themselves, they need to know the challenges that Muslims are facing, and they must be able to be able to respond to them in a very intellectual manner. Very often, I think Muslims we respond in a very emotional way, and that's not helpful at all. We need to learn how to respond intellectually. I think it's a challenge for the youth as well. That with all the challenges that we are facing, we need to, first of all, we need to be knowledgeable. You need to know exactly what is happening, and then once we understand it, we need to know how to respond to them. So I think these are many challenges that our young people have. Inshallah, hopefully, they will begin to, understand that the position of Muslims all over the world has become very precarious, and we need to uh, prepare ourselves to face these challenges.
I think rightfully, as you said, it's important for us to be knowledgeable so that we can engage on a global platform. And we talk about being part of a global ummah really means about not necessarily diluting your ethnicity, which comes through in this book. This idea that you don't have to dilute who you are in order to be a Muslim, but to break those barriers that divide as such. And to be engaging is to be knowledgeable on the topic so you can stand up on that equal basis, on that level playing field to say, this is who we are and this is what we stand for. And I'm so grateful we had the time to chat to you this afternoon about the book. I hope that, many of our, not just, I mean, beyond community, I hope that many South Africans will be picking up this particular document and reading it and understanding the significant contribution made by the Imam throughout his lifetime and beyond, and taking significant lessons from there as well. So Jazakallah khair for your time, Prof. Dangor. It was really great hearing from you about your process and the importance of Imam Al Seppe's contribution.
Okay, maybe just a comment also. I think what's also happened here is that it has given the Black Muslim community a sense of pride. And I'll tell you why. Because when we had the book launch, the majority of people who attended were from the Black Muslim community, including people who did not know Isa, who never met Isa. But here they saw that here was one of the community who was being honored, somebody who was being recognized. And I think that's what it pleased them so much, in a sense of being empowered, and therefore you saw many of them coming to, not a great number, but the majority obviously were from the African Muslim community. And the fact that they did not know him, or know about him, had never met him, they came there because of seeing that there was at last a Black Muslim community was being celebrated, and was being recognized and acknowledged. Okay, so these my last few words, Shafinaaz.
Jazakallah khair for that, for those of us who didn't make it to that particular launch. And I think it is significant just to the contribution, but also in terms of affirming how important his contribution was. May Allah forgive his shortcomings and accept his efforts with greatness, inshallah. And may Allah broaden and lighten his cover. Jazakallah khair. Once again, we're going to end with that for today. And I just want to repeat that copies are available at Baitul Hikmah in Overport and online at the Hikmah store and through the Okaf network as well. And that's it from us this weekend, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. I hope that we added value through the discussion around the life and times of Imam Essa al Seppe, produced by Professor Suleman Dangor. And Jazakallah khair once again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Until next weekend.